Hi there, my name is Bryan Coleman. I am a motion design director and style frame artist based out of Los Angeles. I work with After Effects, Redshift, Arnold, Octane, and Xparticles, but most importantly, Cinema 4D, which is the foundation of all of my work. Generally, I focus on broadcast and commercial design work, but today I'll be discussing a short film I recently created. I work with a wide range of clients, including Apple, MPC, The Mill, Future Deluxe, Framestore, and Manverse Machine. I'd like to thank Maxon and Matthias for bringing me out to present today to discuss my workflow with Cinema 4D, Redshift, and Red Giant for After Effects. A lot of my work leans towards data visualization, but I also do a lot of work on photorealistic lighting and rendering. Today I'm going to be discussing how to create a bump map in After Effects and Photoshop, which will then be used as a displacement map in Redshift. I'll set up scene lighting and discuss creating a scan line using an area light. I'll touch on using the motion tracker in Cinema to generate motion track details. Then I'll explain render settings and how to set up a ZDepth Pass AOV. I'll use Red Giant trap code form to generate a point cloud and texture map. And finally, I'll show you how to set up tracking points in After Effects to create the final details. Let's take a quick look at my demo reel. Okay, so that was my demo reel. And the next thing I'd like to show you is the project that we are going to be discussing today. Okay, so let's talk about what I want to discuss with you today, which is this shot right here. So we're going to talk about how to create a displacement bump map in After Effects, which is going to help us to create these meteor fallouts right here, these meteor craters. And I'll show you how to do some of the scan lines and some of the tracking points. So let's get started. So let's head into After Effects. And I started with this really cool moon surface texture scan that I got off of the NASA website. They have a ton of really cool stuff. And this all started because I had been working with one client, and the project sort of evolved. And much like any project I work on, I always kind of want to like do my own thing with it. So I started to mess around with some Redshift and displacement. And I'll show you how I got to the final product. So let's create a new composition. We'll make it 1,000 by 1,000, and we're going to call this circle. And I will create a new solid that's black, and I'll create a new solid which is white. And let's hit Q, and that's going to bring up my circle or ellipse mask tool. I'll feather this down just a little bit, and I'm going to add a roughen edges texture to it. We'll just increase the border a little bit here. maybe reduce the size or the scale, and then take the complexity up to about 10. I'll actually just duplicate this and make it black. That way I don't have to double back on some of the work I've already done. I'll hit M twice, and let's take the expansion down a little bit. So at this point, this is the foundation of the crater that we're making. So any area that's white right here will be displaced upwards, and any area that's black will not be touched at all. So let's take that circle that we just created and drop it in on top of our moon base. Let's create a new adjustment layer, and I'll put an exposure on that adjustment layer, and let's make sure that the circle is on top of that. Take the exposure down of that back plate. Let's create this little garbage mat around here, and I'll feather it out, make it subtract. And at this point, this is going to sort of mute out some of this background stuff, and we'll have this central area here, which is going to have a lot of details in it. So let me fast forward a little bit and take you into Photoshop, which is, this is the texture that ultimately I ended up creating. I found that darkening these edges and keeping this the most contrast was visually the most interesting. And I would go into Filter 3D and then generate bump height map, and that would create this really lovely bump map, which you'll see here. So this is the final version or the final product of that. The reason that I'm not showing it right now is just because it takes a little bit of time to generate. You have to let it do its work, and you can see here that it blurs things out quite a bit, creates, I don't know, just sort of blends things together really nicely. So that is one technique I use for creating bump maps. So let's take this into Cinema now, and we'll start to build out our scene. So the first thing that I want to do is create a new plane. Let's make that 1920 by 1080, and we'll do the width and height segments to be about 20. And I'm going to create a new Redshift material. We will drag and drop that Redshift material onto the surface of the plane. We'll double click our material, and I'm going to type in texture to bring in a texture node. Under general, we can apply our main moon texture to it. And let's do a little color correct node in here too, which I like to do as much work as possible procedurally within Redshift. I think it gives you a lot of power to make changes on the fly as opposed to having to do things in Photoshop or After Effects and then bringing them in again. So I like to do everything on the fly, including color correct. So let's take the out color, connect that to the input and the out color of our color correct, and we will connect this to the diffuse color. For this color correct, I just had a couple of changes that I made, which I will change the gamma here to be 1.48, and my contrast, I'm going to make that 0.7. So at this point, I've got my base texture applied to the plane, and I just want to double click that, go to my editor tab, and change the default texture preview size to 1024 as opposed to the default, which is it just makes things a little bit more clear and easier to see. So at this point, I want to control, grab, and drag my texture node, and let's change the texture that's on there to be the bump map. So we've got our bump map loaded, and I need to attach a bump map node to that. So let's apply our bump map to the bump map node, and we will apply this then to the overall bump input. And let's change this height to be about 2. And I'm going to control, drag, release. That's going to create a duplicate of my texture. And I want to add another color correct node in here. And I want to create a displacement node as well. So we'll drop that in there. So let's take the out color to the input of the color correct and the out color of color correct to the displacement texture map. And then we will apply that to our material output displacement. So let's make one small adjustment to my color correct in here, which I will make that be 0.1. So it's going to flatten things out a little bit, but a little goes a long way when playing with displacement maps. So let's take a quick look and see how this is all coming together. So let's go Redshift. So this is my setup for Redshift right now, my render view. So I'll just click play and we can take a look at what's going on here, which in this moment, everything is very white. And I believe it's probably because I made a mistake on my color correct, which I did. I made it 11.48. It needs to be 1.48. So a little mistake there. Okay, so this is starting to come along, but we're not really seeing any displacement or anything on there. So let's make one adjustment here inside the texture map. So for the displacement, I actually want to increase that to about 10. And then on my plane, I'm going to attach a Redshift object tag, and I'll go into the geometry tab and click on override, click on tessellation. For the maximum subdivisions, let's turn this up to 16. For the minimum edge length, I'm going to leave this at 4 right now, but I will take it down to 1 for final rendering. It gives us a lot more detail when we do that. And let's also enable displacement. And right here for the maximum displacement, we want to make that 35. So you're starting to see a few things happen here. So we can kind of see our bump starting to work and our displacement starting to work. But let's do one more thing, which is really going to make this sing. And at this point, we can see our displacement. We're getting our craters in there. We're getting all this really pretty displacement down here from all these little nooks and crannies. So this is starting to look pretty good. At this point, I want to add a little bit of lighting because right now we're just using the default lighting setup in Redshift. So let's do one thing first, which I'm just going to create a new camera, which is going to create a camera in my perspective view here. I'll make sure that I have that selected, and I will add a protection tag to that. And you can do that by just searching up here if you know what you're looking for. I'll go out to my 4-pane view, and under camera, switch that to the perspective mode. So let's make sure. Not sure why it's doing that. There we go. We were just in a little too close, and that's okay. So let's go to quick shading, and now we can see our scene as it's being set up. So, okay, this is working really well so far. So let's create a new Redshift sun and sky rig. And I wouldn't always use this setup, but it just seemed to work really well for what I was trying to do in this moment. The first thing I want to do is just adjust the coordinates of where my sunshine is coming from. So let's just change that to -48 and -164. Make sure we do it right, 164. And then let's change this to 56. So that's starting to look really cool already. If we were working on a big scale, these hard-edged shadows here would work perfectly. But because I'm going to end up in sort of this micro world with these macro shots, I'm going to end up blurring these out a little bit. So let's make some quick adjustments here. So for my sky, I want to make the intensity multiplier be 1.75. Let's make an adjustment to the coloration here. So if I go down here to the red and blue shift, you can make it really orange or really blue. But I will make mine be about -0.1, so it's just a touch of blue. You can see that right here, just a touch. And then on saturation, let's just make this 0.75. Just kind of want to smooth things out a little bit. One thing that you'll notice here is that I'm getting a little bit of reflection. It's a little too much. It's still really glossy. So let's let's double click on the material. And under the Redshift material, let's change the roughness to be about 0.7. So I think that works pretty well. If you end up cranking it all the way up to 0.8, there's something that it just makes it a little too white across the board. So let's just leave a little bit of roughness in there, or excuse me, a little bit of reflection in there. I think that's going to work pretty well. So the other thing I want to do is just make a quick adjustment to my shadows here, which I can do if I go into my, Redshift sky, sun, and on the sun disk scale, let's set this to 20. So that just softens up my shadows a little bit. So it really reinforces that we're up close on something, because the farther away you are on something, especially like the sun, the shadows are going to be quite harsh. Okay, so I think that's pretty good for this. So let's just set up some depth of field, because we have this really lovely depth of field in the foreground with everything in the middle here in focus. So we will attach a Redshift camera tag to that. Let's go to bokeh and let's turn on override and enable that. And for the radius here, let's set this to 10, and we'll see initially that everything is out of focus. And all we have to do is just make sure that we're adjusting our focal point to be right in the middle. And sometimes I might even crank this up to be really extreme, just so I can know exactly where I'm looking here. So I think that's good. So let's take this back down to 10. The next thing that I want to do is just make a really quick adjustment to my scene rendering here, because right now it just sort of feels a little plastic. It's not quite rendering exactly the way that I would want it to. So in my render settings, let's adjust the renderer to be the Redshift renderer. I'll turn the samples max up to 1024. Sometimes I'll crank these up much higher for the final renders, but for right now, I think that will work. Under the primary GI engine, let's make that brute force, and instantaneously we have this very natural lighting setup. It's got a tint of blue in some of the areas that aren't getting hit by the sun, and we can see the sunshine colors coming through. So that's really nice. That's what we're looking for there. The next thing that I want to do is just quickly show you how to create some of these little shadows in here, which the point of this is really that we're only seeing a really small part of this really huge scene. So there might be some craters or some other objects that are off camera here that are creating these shadows. So it helps to create some visual interest as well, just to make everything so it's not perfect, much like the real world. So let's just create a plane really quickly, and let's make it pretty big, and let's just drag it down a little bit. So we're just kind of getting a little bit of shadow right here. And the further away I get from my point of view, the more blurry the shadows become, of course. And let's just let's duplicate this. And I'll just hold Control and drag that over. So now we've got these shadows on both sides. So we've kind of got our light coming through the middle here. We've got some sort of object here and down here, which is really adding some nice detail to it. So let's go ahead and just quickly render this out. So we've got everything in place. Let's render that out. So the next thing I want to show you is how to create these laser lines here that are scanning the surface. Like these aliens have come in, or humans are on an alien planet. They have all this technology, and they're just gently scanning everything. We're getting all this feedback from all these bits of data, and it's all feeding into the mothership. At least that's what I imagine is happening. So let's recreate some of that stuff. So if I go into my Redshift tab and create a new area light, and you can see already that it's pretty hot. To rotate that by 90 degrees, I'm going to make it really, really long, and I'll make it really, really narrow. And we can see that we're getting a lot of light spreading all over the place here. So we'll just make one really quick adjustment, which under your General tab, down here where it says Spread, let's just take this down close to 0. And the closer I get to 0, the less spread out it becomes which emulates the idea of a laser light, which is pretty cool. So I think that's looking really good. I might rotate it a little bit just so it's not perfectly aligned to camera. Then if I just scrub it back and forth, we can see that it's looking really cool. All right, so let's just turn the opacity of it, the brightness of it down a little bit because it's coming in really hot. So if I just take this down to maybe like 10, it starts to just soften up the edges a little bit. So I think that's working pretty well so far. So I've got my render done of my moon here, and I need to render out my laser light, but I need to comp them together in After Effects. So I need to get this laser separated, but I need to retain all of this displacement map information that I've got going on. So let's duplicate the material that we've already created, and I will drag that onto the plane, and I want to rename this texture blackout. And where my diffuse color is, let's disconnect my moon color, and let's make that black. All right, so at this point, everything should be rendering without any texture on it. So we're sort of getting this really dark surface here. And then all I need to do is turn off my sun and my sky. And maybe let's just increase the intensity a little bit just so we can see it better. So now we've got this laser beam that's going across the surface here. And so now we can render that out and take that into After Effects. So let's go ahead and grab my moon base here. So I've got this all rendered out, and it's already animated and everything. The camera's animated. Let's take our light and drop that on top, and we'll turn the mode to add. And if I just scrub through this really quickly, we can see that it looks like it's scanning the surface. So that's pretty cool. The next thing, let's just discuss how to create these tracking points here. And I'm going to be using Cinema to do this portion of it. And I'll go back to my standard view to create a new scene. Under Tracker, let's bring up Motion Tracker. And under the footage, let's bring in my motion track scene. So it's basically just the render that I just put out. Let's adjust the samples to the resampling to be 75%. So if I just scrub through this really quickly, you can see that this is the render that I just put out a little bit ago. So let's go into 2D tracking, and for the number of tracks, I'll take that down to about 200. Let's leave the minimum spacing. Let's create some auto tracks, and immediately you can see these little points pop up, which it's understanding that it needs to grab on to the little dots. So for the minimum length of the frames, I'll make that 5. And I'm going to auto track. So at this point, Cinema is working, and you can see down here, it's processing each frame. So for each frame, each of these points is looking at its pixel or its pixel area and just trying to track along with it. So once we're done here with this, we can just scrub through it and see which of our points have retained their pixel area, and maybe some of them have fallen off. So a few of them did fall off up here, and a few did fall off down here, and that works really good, actually, for this scene, because where it's in focus, I want more of those little dots, the tracking points, and where it's out of focus, I just want a little bit less. So you can sort of see them tracking along. At this point, let's go to our 3D solve. We'll go to the Run 3D Solver. So Cinema at this point is taking all that 2D tracking information, and it's going to generate some tracking points in 3D space, and then also it will generate a new camera. Under Motion Track, under our 3D Solve, let's go to Display, and let's change that to Rectangle, and under Radius, let's switch that to be about 5. Now if I click on my Auto Features tab, you can see that we've got some of these green squares, rectangles, or some red ones. So the green ones mean that it tracked really well. The red ones mean that it didn't track so well, but that's okay because this is just all garnishment on some of the work that we've already done. You could also change this to circle or diamond, and you could increase the size of them a little bit so you can see them better. But for me, I'll show you even a better way to see this. So if you just duplicate this camera and make sure that it's highlighted, you can now see all of these tracking points. And we have our camera, which that's all just tracking along really well. But I will change these back to rectangle and decrease them down to 5. And now we can see that we've got our little tracking points here. So let's just do a quick render. We're going to use the hardware renderer, but in order to make this look right, I need to make an adjustment to my backplate here to the gradient. So I'll just go into my preferences, scheme colors, and editor colors. Let's change the gradient 1 and gradient 2 to be black. We'll go into our render settings, change the renderer to hardware. And I don't want to save this right now because I just want to show you what it's going to look like. So we've got this black background and we've got these points that are green and red. So let's just take this into After Effects and drop it on top. And so because it's black, if I switch this to add, the black will have 0 impact on my rendering here. And now I can see all of my motion tracks, and those will all scan along with my footage. So that's all looking really, really cool. Do a little quick RAM preview here. One thing that you will notice, though, is that any area that is out of focus here in camera is not out of focus for my motion tracks. So I just need to create a depth map in Redshift to bring into After Effects to make that happen. So let's switch over to Cinema again, and I'll go back to my original scene, and I'll make sure that my texture is the moon texture that's on there. And I'll zoom out just a little bit, and let's go back into the Redshift layout that I had been using earlier. I'll click play just so that we can see everything that we've already done. And let's just set up that ZDepth Pass. So let's go into the render settings. You can hit Control B to do that, or you can click up here on the little cog wheel. Under Redshift, let's go into AOV tab, and under the Show AOV Manager, click that, and then let's grab depth, drag that in, click on it. For depth mode, let's change that to normalized. And I'm going to make a little change in here because right now the use camera near and far is going to be looking at the camera's rear clipping and near clipping to create the depth map, but I don't want that. I know that my focal point is around 700, 600, 700. So let's just make a quick adjustment to the minimum depth, which I'll change that to 375, and my maximum depth is going to be 800. So at this point, because we've created that AOV, we can now see that we have this depth 0 pass drop down. So let's click on that, and we're not seeing anything. And the reason that we're not seeing anything is because we need to be able to click on the bucket rendering. So the only way to see the depth pass is to click on bucket rendering, which it took me a little while to figure that out. So if you're not seeing anything in regards to your passes, just make sure that you're always on bucket mode, because that's the only way to see it. So I'll go quickly back into After Effects, though, because it can take a little bit of time to render that stuff out. So we can see here that I've got my depth map. Everything that's on the top or the farthest away from the camera is whiter, and everything that's closer is blacker or darker. So let's combine the depth and the motion track right now. I'll hit Control-Shift-C on a PC, and that will bring up a new comp with those two objects, and I will just call this motion track. Let's double click on that to come into the composition. I'll just turn off the depth because we don't really need it. I'll create a new adjustment layer, and I'm going to use Frischluft depth of field because that's what I like. You can use After Effects camera lens blur, which will also be able to use depth pass. But let's rename this adjustment layer DOF for depth of field. Under my depth layer, let's make sure that it's looking at the depth, and let's crank this up to be about 50 for the radius, and everything blurs out. We can see here that everything in the background where it's white is in focus and everything in black is out of focus. So let's just tell it where to be in focus. And we'll just click right in the center. And so now we've got everything in the middle here, which is in focus, and everything outside of that is out of focus. One thing that I will do sometimes is to make a quick adjustment in here to make my bokeh be oblong or elliptical instead of completely perfectly circle. Because if you make it perfect like that, I don't think it looks that realistic all the time. It's nice just to change up that shape, and you would do that in Cinema by going into your camera and making the aspect be like 0.75 or something like that. So little things like that, little details will really sell the idea a little bit more, just to make it look a little bit better. The next thing I want to show you is how to create some of these little dots in here, which are like these little data bits that are scanning everything. It's just garnishment. Again, it's just little bits and details, and it's like you're layering up that cake just to sell the final idea. So I will do that by creating a new composition by hitting Control-C on a PC, and I will just call this form. I'll make the comp 1920 by 1080, and I will generate a new solid, which is the same size as my comp. I will go into my effects, type in form, drag that on to the solid, and it will generate a default base form. And I know some of my settings in here, so I'll just make a couple of quick adjustments. The particles in Z, let's just take that down to 1. And my X, Y, Z, I want those individual. For X, I want that to be 1020. For Y, I want that to be 790. For my particles in X, I want those to be 600. And in Y, I want it to be 300. And for the particle itself, I want to take off the sphere feather. For the size, let's make this 0.5. For the size random, let's take that up to 100%. And opacity random, let's take that up to 100% as well. So right now, we've got our base set up, and all we need is the camera from our scene, cinema scene. So I've got that project right here. You can just drag that project in, import that in to After Effects, and you can just drag that into your composition and click Extract. And that will bring in a camera, and it's going to bring in this little plane right here. And I created that plane, just to back up a little bit. In my cinema scene, right-click on that plane and go into Render Tags, External Compositing. And we will go down here to click on solid, and I'll make the X and the Y be 100, and that gets saved out, and then it gets generated back here in After Effects. So let's look at the position of this, because that is the position that we want our particles, our new form particles, to be created. So if I go into my trap code form setup, my red giant trap code form setup, we can see that the position is 960 by 540. And we just need to make sure that those numbers equal these numbers. So let's make this 0, 88.4, and 0. And now we have our dots in space. And if I were to take that new comp and I put it into my build comp that I've already got, and let's make sure we switch form and motion track to be on add. And I'm going to solo form and solo the moon base. We can see that our particles are tracking along perfectly with the surface of the moon. What we're sort of running into here is that because I did this in After Effects and not in Redshift, my form base is completely flat. It's not registering that we have any displacement in here. And there's a few ways that you can adjust this, but I'm going to do it the cheat way because sometimes it just doesn't matter. So I'll duplicate my moon base and I'm going to put that on top of form. Under my track mat, let's change that to be Luma mat. And let's add a levels to that new layer. And let's just crush down the blacks a little bit and bring up the whites a little bit so we can see here that anywhere that is brighter is where the form dots are existing. And anywhere that it's black, it's not really showing. And it just so happens that most of my white areas just happen to be some of the flattest areas. So it's a bit of a cheat, but it's working really well. And you'll also notice that the foreground and the background of those dots, the form dots, is not out of focus. So all I need to do is go into my motion track and copy the depth of field adjustment layer and my depth render, take that into the Red Giant trap code form, and we'll see that everything is out of focus right now. So let's make sure that our depth of field layer is reading the depth render layer. So we can see now that we're getting this in focus area right here and everything else is out of focus. And I'm just going to duplicate the form layer just to add a few more dots in there because I really like the size of them, but they're really small. And if you just duplicate that layer a few times, it'll start to build the structure up a little bit. So let's go back into my main scene and we can see how this is all coming together. So we're getting this little dusting of dots here, and it's not really paying attention to it. It's just kind of a nice fake. It's a nice cheat. But I want to show you another way that I use this. And you can see this other these other dots right here. So there's another layer of dots going on in here. And I did that by creating a new comp. And I'm going to create a texture in After Effects using trap code form, and I'll create a new comp, which is 1000 by 1000, and let's just call this form texture. Click OK. Let's create a new solid, which is black, and I will add form to that. And again, it's going to generate its default setting. So let's go into the base form, and I'll change the particles in Z to be 1. And for the size of XYZ, let's make this 960, which is just a little bit smaller than the composition itself. For the particles in X, let's change it to be 25 and 25. So now we have this very even spacing, so it's going to be very tileable in Redshift. Under the particle, let's make the particle be a 1. The sphere feather will be 0. The opacity, the size random, let's make that 57%. And for the opacity random, let's make that 75%. So we have this really light, gentle dusting of particles. Some are really light, some are a little bit brighter, some are really small in size, some are a little bit bigger. So we're going to render this out and take this into our scene in Cinema and apply that to the surface that we've been creating, and then bring that back into After Effects. So let's do that now. So let's go into Cinema, and I have this black texture that I've already created, this black material. Let's duplicate that. And I'm going to call this form. And I will just drag the form onto my plane, and we can see everything turn black there. And let's just take a look at everything right now, make sure that we're on our beauty pass. So I've got that form texture being applied to the surface. I want to go to progressive rendering because it seems to show you things a little bit faster. So let's double click on our material tag and go into the shader graph. And I'm just going to use the pre-existing texture tab that I've already used, the node, remove the color correction. And let's bring in that texture, the form texture that we just created, and let's apply that to the diffuse color. And I will apply this again to the overall emission color. I'll click on the Redshift material, go to my overall tab, and under emission weight, let's set that to 2. So we can see that we're starting to get some of these dots existing on the surface, and they are actually moving along with these ridges and in the valleys here. So it's just a nice extra little layer just to sell the idea again. And under the Redshift material base properties, let's just turn the roughness all the way down. Excuse me, not the roughness, but the reflectivity all the way down. Because we're using an emission, it'll light up on that surface, and we don't have to have any lights or anything in there. So that's pretty cool. So that works really well. The other thing I want to do is for the Redshift texture, for the scale, I want to increase this number, which is going to increase the number of tiles that are in the scene. So at this point, we have this nice dotted grid structure using Red Giant Trapcode form. So we can render this out, take that back into After Effects, and apply it to the main comp that we have been creating so far. So I will bring in the form texture, and let's apply that, add. And so at this point, we can see our texture, and we can see how things are starting to really come together there. And I'll do sort of an overall composite here at the end just to bring all the colors together. So at this point, I want to show you the final touches to bring all of this together, which are these extra tracking moments where we have these tracking points attracted to some of the stuff on the surface here, and there's lines connecting it together. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of how I did that. So I want to create a new composition, and I'm going to be tracking some of this footage in here. So I also want to grab my light scan. We'll drag that in here, and I want to go into my tracker, and I want to make sure that I have my light scan layer selected. Let's do a track motion, and that brings up a new window, which is going to bring up a track point icon. And I want to drag that, and I just want to set it on the surface of this laser scan. And if we come back into our video, we can see that we have these little points that are tracking along with that laser light. And it's just sort of a fun little thing, like these tracking points are talking to these tracking points. That information is being sent up to the mothership. It's always talking to the mothership. It's always doing something cool. It's what aliens do, I guess. So let's go ahead and make sure we're at 0, and we will click Analyze Forward. So at this point, After Effects is analyzing all of these frames, and it's doing its best to track along. I'm going to skip ahead to show you the final result. Let's create a new null object, and I'm going to call this point 1, and I will duplicate that, and it'll be point 2, and duplicate it again, and it's going to be point 3. So we're going to create 3 points here. So on my light scan, I'm going to go back into my tracker, and underneath the edit target, let's make sure that we have point 1 selected and click OK. And then we will click apply. It'll bring up this dialog and we will say yes to that. So now we have this tracking point 1 here, which is tracking along with what we just tracked on that scan line. So that's working really well there. The next thing I want to do is have my moon base selected, and I want to do track motion on that. And I'm going to set up 2 points on this. The first one I'll just set up over here. You can see this little splotch right here. I just want to track this guy. So I want to make sure that I have that selected and track forward. And so again, After Effects is going to track forward from where my point in time was. And I'll redo that a little bit just to make sure that we have everything from start to finish, because I made a mistake of starting here in the beginning. No big deal. And now I can say analyze backwards. So at this point, I will have a track from 0 to 6 seconds. And I want to go into my edit target. And this one we will apply to point 2. Click OK. So now we've got, click apply first. Make sure you click apply. All right, so now we've got point 1, which is attached, and point 2, which is attached. You can see how straight some of this stuff is. I could probably have just manually done it, but I'm not sure if you can see some of this off where it didn't track properly. That, again, it sort of works really well with some of the tracking stuff. You just kind of want it to be a little bit, a little more natural, just to not be so perfect. I'm going to skip ahead to show you how I connected the nulls together. Let's create a new solid, and I'll make this guy black. And I'm going to use the plugin beam, drag that onto the surface so we can see that this beam is now generated. And so we just need to tell it to connect these 2 points together and then these 2 points together. So I am going to create a couple of things in here. We have to write a couple of little annotations in here. So I'm going to alt-click on the starting point for the beam, and let's just give ourselves a little bit of room to work with. So for the expression that we were about to create, let's do x equals, and we'll do our pick whip, and let's come down to our point 1, and for x, let's make sure we click that, semicolon, enter, y equals, pick whip, to our y, semicolon, bracket x, comma, y, bracket, click enter, and let's do our ending point, which our ending point is going to be point 2. So starting point is point 1, ending point is point 2. So again, on a PC, alt-click, and I am actually just going to copy this and paste it, and then change from point 1. I'll just type the 2 in here. Makes it a lot easier, point 2. And click enter on the numeric keypad, zoom out here, and we can see that it doesn't quite reach, and all we need to do is make sure that the length is set to 100, and for the starting thickness, I might just take that down to 2 and 2, so it thins things out a bit. For the inside color, let's make that white, and for the outside color, let's make that sort of a gray. And we do that so that we can add some color to it later, and it just makes sort of very natural tonality across there. So let's call this beam 1, and let's duplicate that, and that'll be beam 2. And now I want to click UU, and that's going to bring up my my expression here again. So for the starting point, let's leave it at point 1. And for my ending point, let's make that point 3. Click OK, and then hit Enter on the numeric keypad, and now we've got 2 of these. So if we look at this, the idea was always that this point is latching itself onto some of these other points out here, but it doesn't always remain on those, and sometimes it breaks away and finds another point that it finds more interesting. So I'll just scrub to like 2 seconds, or let's just make it 3 seconds. So it's kind of getting close to this. So at this point, let's just hit Alt and a bracket to shorten that, and Alt and a bracket to shorten that. And at this point, we can see, if I just do a little RAM preview of this, we can see that right around 3 seconds, it's going to break from the original point, and it's going to latch on to that new point. Very cool. And let's go into our main comp here. Let's drag in the thing that we just created, which was this comp, which I think is this one here. This is why naming conventions are the best thing you can do for yourself, but working on the fly, it's not always easy. So now we can see that we've got these tracking points in here, which are all looking pretty cool. So the final thing that I want to show you is let's really finish this up. Let's really make this cool, because I need to bring in the depth of field into this comp that we just created. Make sure that our depth of field is attached to the right layer. And we can see that we're getting some depth of field in there. So anyway, that's working pretty well. Yeah, there we go. I think that's all working pretty good. So might just turn this off. I feel like it's giving me a false result. Oh, there we go. All right, so that's exactly what we want right there. So if we zoom in here now, we can see that all of my elements that I've created outside of Cinema are out of focus because of the depth of field that I created. Got my laser light, got my tracking point. So let's just bring it all together. So I like to use Video Copilot Color Vibrance. I think it does a fantastic job of colorizing things. Let's make sure that, let's just make everything orange. One thing you actually want to focus on, you see how this is sort of this burnt color? You want to go into the main composition that you're trying to colorize and add a black layer to the bottom of it. If I come back out here, you can see that it really brightens things up quite a bit. So that's looking really cool. Let's add that to the form texture so everything just turns orange. And let's add it to the motion track, and you'll notice here that it doesn't really colorize it that well. And the reason that's happening is because it really prefers a white and black to colorize things. So I will add a hue saturation and desaturate it all the way down to -100. And once again, add that to our light scan. So this is all coming together perfectly. I think you could probably keep doing some more work to it, which I did endlessly because I can never finish things sometimes. I just want to make it perfect. So let's take a look at the final result one more time. All right, and that about does it for me. So today I went over creating a bump map in After Effects and Photoshop. We took that into Redshift and created a displacement map with it. I set up scene lighting and spoke about creating a scan line using an area light. We touched on the motion tracker in Cinema to generate motion track details. I explained how to set up some render settings and set up a ZDepth Pass with the AOV. use Red Giant trap code form to generate a point cloud, and then also a texture map, which then was used as a texture inside Redshift. And finally, I showed you how to set up tracking points in After Effects and connect them together to give it the final details. Once again, my name is Bryan Coleman. I am a motion design director. You can check me out at bryancoleman.com, on Instagram at Bryan the Coleman, and on Twitter at Bryan the Coleman. I really appreciate your time today. I hope that you have walked away with a better understanding of how I use cinema, and maybe it'll help you in the future. Thanks so much.